The majority of the island of Ireland in the early Middle Ages was dominated by the Over-King of the Uí Néill, often the King of Tara. This prestigious title was not inherited but won by the strongest contender, and for most of the 7th century, the strongest contender belonged to the offspring of King Áed of Sláine, the Áed Sláine. Members of the Southern Uí Néill that had burst forth into the Midlands during Ireland's prehistory, the dynasty had established themselves on the eastern coast, creating the Kingdom of Brega, in which lay the sacred centre of Tara itself. Throughout the 7th century and well into the 8th, Áed's descendants dominated the political scene in Ireland, seeming destined for supremacy. Yet power comes at a price, and the family of King Áed of Sláine would pay a steep one indeed for their unrelenting pursuit of it. The Uí Néill descendants of Niall of the Nine Hostages emerged from Connacht in 2 prongs, establishing, among many others, 4 major kingdoms, 2 in the north and 2 in the Midlands. They were not a tribe but a dynasty descended from one common ancestor, and in the early 6th century, when these movements were taking place, could not have consisted of more than a few dozen people scattered throughout the northern half of Ireland. At this stage, they were not yet distinct from their Connachtha kinsmen to the west. By the early 7th century, however, they were diverging, and cracks were beginning to emerge in their own ranks. The death of King Diarmaid, progenitor of the 2 most important Southern Uí Néill kingdoms, eventually resulted in their territories splitting between the Clan Chulmáin, the children of Culmán the Great in the west, and the Áed Sláine, the seed of Áed of Sláine, in the east. They were not responsible for the conquest of the Midlands from Leinster, however. That was achieved mainly by Carpra, son of Niall, and his family, the Kindred of Carpra, from 495 to 535. His descendants by the historical period were minor players, however, and thus their past was rewritten, their former deeds attributed to others, and their claims to the Kingship of Tara erased. It was this kingship which Diarmaid successfully seized. But what exactly was the Kingship of Tara? It is a question with no clear answer. The site of Tara lies today in County Meath and consists of several prehistoric monuments and tombs dating back thousands of years. As Byrne noted, Tara is by no means an impressive site on its low ridge in the heart of Meath. The banks and mounds might even be overlooked by a careless visitor. Described by an early Christian writer as the capital of the Irish and their Babylon, it's clear Tara had otherworldly associations, while its kingship was not ordinary, being a distinction of peculiar importance, though the true reasons for why are hard to decipher and beyond the scope of this video. Throughout Irish history, the glory of Tara has always lain in the past. Even in the 6th century, this statement was true. The hill of Tara had long lain abandoned. Yet kings of Tara were not required to dwell at the hill, and despite the fact that the site would come to be located in the kingdom founded by the descendants of Áed of Sláine, it could still be claimed by other distant lords. Before the dawn of history, kings from Leinster dominated the site, while Ulster also attained the kingship at times, and depending on who you ask, even kings of Munster. Not until the 4th century did the Connachtha begin to contest it. By the 8th century, it became the title claimed by the overlord of the Uí Néill dynasties, but only after they had excluded all the other kingdoms from it. Whatever its previous meaning, by the historical period, therefore, the King of Tara was the head of the various Uí Néill families and their vassals, with claims to supremacy over other kingdoms. However, attaining the Kingship of Tara did not truly guarantee anything in terms of power. It varied widely depending on the individual king and on each man's ability to enforce and make a reality of their claims. As Charles Edwards paraphrased from one of the early Irish law tracts, his due is measured by his fist. Thou must take care, my son, lest for the sin of murdering thy kinsman, thou lose the right of governing the whole of Ireland, as was first assigned thee by God. For if at any time thou dost commit that sin, thou shalt not hold the whole of thy father's kingdom, but only a part of it in thine own people, and that but for a short time. Byrne notes that Áed's father Diarmaid had a surprisingly unpropitious reign for so famous a king, and the same can certainly be said of his son. When Diarmaid fell at the hand of the Ulster monarch in 565, he left behind several descendants, the most important being his grandson Sivna and Áed Sláine himself, with rivalry between the two families beginning very early. Reigning since 598, in 600 Áed killed his nephew to secure his grip on the Kingship of Tara, but this was disputed by the Uí Néill of the north. They never had the opportunity to clash, for Sivna's son retaliated by having Áed himself assassinated only 4 years later. 5 of his sons are known to have succeeded him as either King of Brega, King of Tara, or both. 2 died of plague, while the other 3 fell fighting their cousins to the east. All of these early kings are shadowy figures about whom little is known, but some details can be pieced together. Áed Slaine's immediate successor was one of his sons, but all we know of him was that he died in 612 in battle near modern-day Navan against his cousin, likely in an attempt to become King of Tara himself. His brother succeeded him and likewise died in battle in 634, fighting the new king of Meath, the same man who had ordered the assassination of his father. It was another brother, Diarmaid the Heroic, who avenged them the following year, leaving him as the most powerful man among the Southern Uí Néill, allowing him in 649 to invade and defeat the neighbouring kingdom of Connacht. Such opposition as the Northern Uí Néill could muster to his authority was decisively checked when he defeated their leaders in 654, killing one and hauling the other into imprisonment at the prehistoric graveyard of Brú-na-Bóinne. Yet during these years it seems that his presumably elder brother Blomach was king of Brega and later Tara, though others say they shared the kingship. Either way, by 662, Diarmaid the Heroic's patience had run out. His forces defeated those of his brother, killing a nephew in the process and probably deposing him. In the end, the outcome mattered little. A great plague struck 3 years later in 665, killing up to 1/3 of Ireland's population, including the 2 brothers. Yet their achievements, for a time, endured. We may have summarised their lives and careers in a matter of minutes, but these events played out over decades, our sources for the period being unfortunately too scanty for longer discussion. But historians have noted how Diarmaid and Blomach dominated Uí Néill politics for 2 decades before their deaths, and how it was they, not one of their more well-remembered ancestors, who truly established Southern Uí Néill power in the Midlands. This fact is well illustrated by the rapid succession, with no discernible opposition, of a son of Blomach to the supreme kingship of Tara. Yet Tara was not a kingdom in the traditional sense. It was a suzerainty. Their true kingdom was that of Brega, and its importance to Áed Slaine's dynasty cannot be overstated. A golden wand laid across a plate of white bronze. That is what the seed of Áed Sláine are athwart Brega's plain and all opulence whatsoever. Ever grandly ordered household, 'tis with that of Áed Sláine that men compare it. Brega likely takes its name from the magnificent plain, Mag Mreg, that is its defining geographical feature. It was this plain that made Brega the most agriculturally productive region of early medieval Ireland, and thus its richest and most densely populated kingdom. It was also a hub for trade into Ireland from Britain and Europe, with its low-lying topography, easy accessibility from the sea, extensive navigable river system, and a large road network, which was constructed and maintained by the king. The geography of the region and its status as a nodal point connecting many parts of Ireland made it strategically important. The kingdom had 4 ports where luxury goods from Britain and the continent might land, with evidence for advanced craftsmen also in abundance at the realm's royal sites. The Uí Néill are known to have had merchants who served them in trade, one supposedly with over 50 ships in his fleet. Apart from these economic boons, Brega was also full of symbolic and prestigious sites such as Tara and the ancient tombs at Brúnaboinne. One of these necropolises at Noath, considered a gateway to the other world, would become a royal seat for Brega's kings and home to their chief fort. Likewise, the royal graveyard at Cerna was also known as a fairy hill or she. The lands around it were associated with the production of the special royal ale of Brega. In prehistoric times, these sites had made Brega the centre of Irish paganism, yet later it included a great many churches and monasteries, focal points of wealth in early Ireland. All these factors combined to make Brega the most sought-after kingdom in Ireland. As with other early polities, Brega's borders were not fixed, and its size probably fluctuated over time, depending on the political power of its rulers. But essentially, it was formed from the geographic space that encompasses modern County Meath and parts of North County Dublin and South County Louth. It was quite a large kingdom, approximately 3,500 square kilometres. It was home to many minor kingdoms and dynasties, over which the Áed Sláine claimed overall authority, their conquest being one of subjection, not expropriation. The most important of these were the Connachta, Mugdurna, Gailinge and Sanya. Their cousins to the east ruled the Kingdom of Brega, and although the two northern Uí Néill kingdoms sometimes had a common overking, known as the King of the North, no such position existed among the southern Uí Néill. Control over the Boyne Valley in the northeast was hotly contested with Ulster. The southern border was disputed with Leinster, who had been the original lords of the Midlands, while their distant kinsmen to the east and north were rivals for overall domination, represented by the Kingship of Tara, over which they often clashed. When kings of Brega rose to the Kingship of Tara, they sometimes, though rarely, clashed with Connacht or Munster, kingdoms who for long periods had treaties of non-aggression with the Uí Néill. Their geographic position thus gave the seed of Áed Sláine many strengths, including a large economic base and manpower pool, but also meant they were vulnerable to rebellious sub-kings and outside attack from all sides, including the sea. This fact would be well illustrated with the arrival of the Vikings and is shown even earlier by the Great Northumbrian raid in 684. Thus we have the reality of the Kingdom of Brega, an economic, political and clerical powerhouse, yet it was a kingdom riven with strife throughout the early medieval period. Indeed, it was precisely because it was such a powerhouse that prompted the divisions within it. The 6-year reign of Blomach's son was largely uneventful until his death at the hands of a minor Uí Néill sub-king, MacNicoll noting of the murder that both cause and occasion are obscure. A private grudge seems the most likely explanation. His brother smoothly succeeded him, but his reign was just as uneventful until 675, when he died in battle against the forces of his uncle, Fionnachta of the Feasts, who would go on to be the dynasty's strongest early king. His first action was to crush any potential challenge from his northern kin. He marched deep into their territory and destroyed their chief fort, the Grianán of Aileach. He then checked 2 assaults on Brega from the kingdoms of Leinster and Ulster, ordering the King of Leinster assassinated soon after for his insolence. But it was from across the sea in the Saxon kingdom of Northumbria that the greatest attack on his kingdom came in the year 684, when a raid ordered by King Ecgfrith devastated the land and took many captives. The motive remains debated with several competing theories. The first is that Ecgfrith was striking against the Uí Néill as a whole, Fionnachta being their overking, for supporting the claims of his half-brother Aldfrith to the Northumbrian throne. Aldfrith's mother was a member of one of the 2 dominant branches of the northern Uí Néill, and during his brother's reign he had spent his exile studying in Ireland under Saint Adomnan, possibly at a Southern Uí Néill monastery. The historian Moisel argues that Ecgfrith's raid was a preemptive strike on the Uí Néill for conspiring with his enemies to depose him in favour of his brother, something he believes they were successful in when, in the year after the raid, 685, a Pictish Dalriathan alliance he alleges was supported by the Uí Néill slew Ecgfrith and saw Alfrith, then at the Gaelic monastery of Iona, ascend to the throne. As confirmation, he cites Alfred's subsequent release of the hostages from Brega. Charles Edwards makes the case that religious differences between the Gaelic and Roman Church on the dating of Easter were behind Ecgfrith's attack. The main cleric of Northumbria, the Bishop of York, claimed ecclesiastical jurisdiction over northern Britain and Ireland, and Ecgfrith, by imposing the Roman Easter on the most powerful of Irish kings, would be able to claim a political hegemony over the same area while also gaining favour with the Church. Yet, perhaps the more mundane motive offered by Peltoret is the most realistic. Ecgfrith attacked Brega not for any high-minded political purpose, but because Brega was rich and he needed plunder. In any event, the kingdom was set upon suddenly by Anglo-Saxon warriors from the sea, and the sporadic resistance offered by the surprised men of Brega could not prevent them taking hostages back to Northumbria, though these were later released by the new king following an embassy by his old friend Saint Adomnan on behalf of Fínachta. After this diplomatic victory, he retired to clerical life in 688, but it didn't last long. The same year saw the Battle of Imlech Pich between two opposing branches of the descendants of Áed Sláine, that divided the dynasty and eventually the kingdom into northern and southern Brega. Such instability and disunity provoked him out of retirement, but his attempts to reunite the various factions ultimately failed. He and his son were killed in battle against a northern branch of the Bregan dynasty in 695, though other annals assert they were instead treacherously assassinated at a negotiation with their leaders. From the death of Fínachta begins the long decline of the descendants of Áed Sláine. With Fínachta's 20-year reign ended, infighting became even more endemic among the royalty of Brega. The next king reigned for around a year before dying naturally, though a later poem claims his brother and successor Iargallach slew him. Both reigned as kings of Brega but not Tara, an important distinction. A half-century of their dynasty's uninterrupted dominance of Ireland's most prestigious kingship had come to an end, a clear indication of their decline. The kingdom was now divided much more clearly than before between two emerging sub-branches of the dynasty, the Uí Cunning in the north and the Uí Chearnaig in the south. Iargallach attempted to bring the south to heel in 701 when he had their leader killed, but it probably only heightened tensions. In 702 he fell to British mercenaries on the island of Ireland's Eye, exiles based on the Isle of Man following the fall of the kingdom of Reged to the Saxons, who had been employed by his rivals to the south. Iargallach was the 10th king of Brega since the reign of Áed Sláine and the 7th to die violently. All had fallen due to conflict with another member of the now large Uí Néill dynastic confederation, to which they themselves belonged. Such numbers can give the impression of anarchy, but it's well to remember these events took place over a century, and the very nature of the annals that are our primary sources can skew the picture. They were the newspapers of their time. Unremarkable peaceful years during the reign of kings are not recorded, so that what looks like inactivity due to no record could well have been stability, unreported as it wasn't newsworthy. True life was different and much tougher than today. Of that the annals do not lie. For the year 701 we have a grim entry indeed, which reads, "Herds of cattle throughout Ireland were almost destroyed, not only in Ireland, but indeed throughout Europe. In the next year there was a human plague for 3 consecutive years. Afterwards came the greatest famine, in which men were reduced to unmentionable foods." the unmentionable foods here being other people. Yet beyond the unpredictability of nature, not all was chaos. Saint Adomnan in 697 managed to mobilize all the kingdoms of the Gaelic and Pictish world to collectively agree to and enact the Law of Innocence, which was designed to enforce the immunity of women, children and clerics having violence used against them, effectively making them non-combatants. It was enforced through a series of fines backed by the religious establishment of Iona and the secular power of the kings, principally the Kingship of Tara. That it was at least somewhat effective may be inferred from the fact that it was renewed yet again 3 decades later. The nobles and kings themselves were the only ones expected to risk their lives on the battlefield, but the aftermath of raids took the harshest toll on the commoner, and the law of innocence was sometimes ignored altogether. The king of Brega, Cinné mac Cunning, for example, a man who the annalists sympathised with in his struggle against Mida, burned 70 people to death after they took shelter at a church in Trevet in the year 850. It did not reduce violence among the nobility. 3 then-present kings and 1 future king from the seed of Áed Sláine are recorded among the guarantors. 3 of the 4 would die violently. The following decades saw more confused clashes between the Uí Cunning and the Uí Néill for supremacy. Of the 2 new emerging kingdoms, North Brega was significantly smaller, but remained by and large the more powerful of the 2, and it is their leaders, the Uí Cunning, that we will mainly follow. With Iargallach's death, his nephew became king in northern Brega, but the increasing ambitions of his rival meant that for a time Southern Brega was the more important of the 2. Fogurtach, king of southern Brega, was exiled to Britain in 714 by the king of Mida for supporting a rival kinsman who intended to dethrone him, but he was back within 2 years. Only with the unrelated death of his distant rival in 722 was Fogurtach able to make himself king of Tara. His reach exceeded his grasp, however, as his brief and unremarkable reign was abruptly terminated in 724 when Iargallach's now prominent son Cinné, the half-blind, slew him, subduing all Brega and taking the kingship of Tara for himself. To begin with, he invaded and defeated the Kingdom of Leinster, who had bested his 2 predecessors, but changes in the political scene were afoot that could not be resisted. The failure of the Uí Cunning or Uí Néill to exclude the other and unite Brega left them both weakened. Cinné was to be the last king of Tara from the dynasty of Áed Sláine for over 200 years. His death in battle in 728 marked the end of his courageous attempt at rebuilding the fortunes of his dynasty, as power, even in the Midlands, moved away from them, coming to rest firmly among the kings of Mida in the east. Religious contemporaries writing in the early 600s believed the descendants of Áed Sláine were destined for supremacy in the then near future, yet they had ruined it through bitter infighting. But what were the underlying reasons for their split and the danger-laden careers of so many of their nobles? The very nature of succession in early Ireland itself. Gaelic Ireland had many laws and even a caste of hereditary judges to advise on cases. But royal succession was not something extensively touched upon in any of the law tracts. It was governed by custom rather than formal legal procedure. A man could be considered to have a strong claim for the kingship of his dynasty if he was part of the Deravine, the descendants of a king down to his great-grandsons. If you slipped outside this bracket, that is, became the great-great-grandson of a king with no other ancestor as king in between, you were no longer considered to have a strong claim. The consequence of this system was that collateral branches had to continually receive the kingship before their 3 generations ran out to keep their claims going. Any attempt to exclude them would be met with furious resistance. Historian James Hogan noted the old proverb that showed clearly their fears: 5 generations from king to spade. Royal factions vying for the throne were therefore an endemic feature of an Irish kingdom, and as observed by historian Owen MacNeill and others, the system of succession was in fact the weakest feature of the Irish polity. But alternation between different branches could also be surprisingly consistent. The Kingship of Tara for 264 years, from 734 to 1022, alternated successively between two dynasties from the northern and southern Uí Néill, with, as we shall see, only one exception. The following decades saw yet more clashes among the Uí Chonnaing and the Uí Chearnaigh, and as avenues for power outside Brega shrunk, both expanded their own domain holdings at the expense of their vassal states, mainly the Cianachta. Further conflict erupted in northern Brega between the Uí Chonnaing and a related, even more obscure branch of the dynasty, the Fir Cúil, as a likely consequence of this. The next king of northern Brega, having defeated both rival groups in 737, may have been better off if he hadn't. Ireland's latest king of Tara, who hailed from the north, had him hanged in 742 after a 14-year reign, likely to stop him making any more progress in uniting the kingdom. Despite their incessant infighting, the descendants of Áed Sláine at this time must have been growing increasingly anxious at the growth in power of their distant kin to the east in Meath. Congalach II, king of Brega, made a determined effort to curb them. His opponent, Donogha, however, was not only king of Meath, but also the most powerful secular lord of his day, the king of Tara. Several clashes and provocations resulted in the Battle of Firchala in 778, where the men of northern Brega were gravely defeated, as the annals lament. From the Battle of Firchala, which was fought on a gloomy, sad Sunday, many a fond mother was sorrowful the Monday on the morrow. This growing power of the kings of Meath prompted an unlikely alliance between the three warring factions of Brega, but unity of this kind presented an obvious threat, so Donogha responded swiftly in 786 by defeating the forces of the descendants of Áed Sláine and killing both the kings of North and South Brega, as well as the king of Fir Cúil. In 781, it had been only a generation since the descendants of Áed Sláine had been primary contenders for the Kingship of Tara and the chief dynasty of Ireland. But their campaigns now no longer took them further afield than Brega, where their new focus lay in conquering lands from their vassals, while the wider kingdom itself still remained divided. MacNicoll noted how at this period of Irish history, the ruling dynasties in the various provinces were still expanding and provoking conflict, still shedding branches incapable of grasping power. Once the expanding ruling dynasty, they now looked more like a shredded branch, soon to be eclipsed by their kinsmen in Meath. Yet that, as MacNicoll goes on, could continue only as long as no new ingredient was injected to upset the balance. That ingredient appeared first in 798, when the Norsemen burnt Inishpatrick and committed grave devastations in Ireland and Scotland. From 786 to 849, there was a further 6 kings from the Uí Chonnaing, only 2 of whom managed to subdue their cousins in the south and gain the full title of King of all Brega. This and the almost complete lack of information on their reigns points to a period of relative insignificance as their fortunes continued to dwindle, with hints that Brega had largely become a vassal state of Meath. When Cinné mac Cunning succeeded his father in 849 after these 6 decades of decline, he set about a rapid reversal of this trend by allying himself with the newest power in the region, the Vikings of Dublin. He led Viking warbands across the entirety of Meath and struck against his brethren of southern Brega, burning their royal cronogh to the ground along with many churches. Not since 786 had a king of Brega so challenged a king of Meath, and it was through guile rather than battle that his life was lost. Called to a parley with the king of Tara, Áed Sláine I, his safety guaranteed by pledges from the clergy and nobles of the land, he was betrayed, bound and drowned in the River Nanny. Alas, O good people, his playful days were better. Great grief that Ciney, son of cunning, is in a sack approaching the pool. After having mangled him in the sea, great grief came over the army on viewing his white ribs on the strand over the cold River Nanny. Although Áed Sláine had rid himself of a dangerous enemy, his betrayal of the oath of safe conduct guaranteed to Ciney was frowned upon. Later, one of the reasons given by the king of the Southern Uí Néill for rebellion against Áed Sláine was his drowning of Ciney. Nowhere in the annals is it suggested Ciney's action was wicked. On the contrary, the annals have nothing but sympathy for him. Viking Dublin's foundation on the very tip of southern Brega was a blessing and a curse. If, as we've seen, Brega's rulers could subdue them and harness their power, it gave them a huge advantage. If they couldn't, however, it represented a strong, hostile neighbour. No one's career illustrates this better than Congalach the Hound of Noth. His grandfather, ancestor of the O'Kelly, O'Dunn and O'Connelly families of Brega, fell at the hands of the Norse, but his son managed to destroy Viking Dublin altogether, forcing the survivors to flee to Britain. 17 years later they returned and inflicted a crushing defeat on the whole Uí Néill, wherein fell 7 Irish kings, including the latest of Brega, Congalach's father. The first decade of his rule was spent crushing local dissent, so that when in 944 opportunity called, he was ready. The alternation that had governed the Kingship of Tara was in crisis. The Clan Colmine to the east and Canail Owen of the north, who had monopolised rule of the Uí Néill between them since 734, saw both their leaders die in rapid succession in the years 943 and 944, leaving no agreed heirs behind them. Opposition came from only one other outsider, the Canail Conall king of the northwest, Ruaidhrí Conannáin. The descendants of Áed Sláine had not supplied a king of Tara since 728, the Canail Conall since 734. Now, with the two most powerful Uí Néill dynasties weakened, each were attempting to revive that centuries-old claim. Ruaidhrí acted first in 945, but his men were blocked and defeated in the plains just north of Brega by the combined forces of Congalach and Amlíb Cuaráin, king of Dublin. Following this up, Congalach subdued Connacht just to the south of Ruaidhrí's kingdom. The first round had gone to him. Ruaidhrí was back again 2 years later to turn the tables when he smashed the combined armies of Brega and Dublin in battle at Sláine. Since 735, the leaders of the north had easy access to Brega and Leinster, thanks to their subjection of the plain of Conall Muirthemne, just to the north, a geopolitically important move the kings of Brega had been unable to counter. Hints of disturbances between the allies after this defeat are hinted in the annals. Congalach himself soon after sacked Dublin for a second time in 2 years. Either he was angry at their conduct at the Battle of Sláine, or perhaps there were 2 factions of Vikings in Dublin, one of which he was hostile to. This theory is reinforced somewhat when we see in the next year Congalach's ally Amlíb left Dublin to begin a second reign in York and was replaced by one Blóchara. Congalach marched once more to Dublin, engaged Blóchara, killing him and upwards of 1,000 of his men. Further Norse raids on Brega would occur over the next 3 years despite this victory, though Congalach's allies may have had ultimate control of the city, as evidenced later. Ruaidhrí had been forced after his victory at Sláine to head back north by rebellions in 947, but he refused to let sleeping dogs lie, returning once again in 950 to ravage the Midlands into submission. He defeated Congalach in battle within Meada, then for 6 months he camped his army within Brega itself and reduced Congalach to dire straits. But just when it looked like he would be forced to capitulate, the Norse of Dublin attacked the camp, and although Ruaidhrí's forces are said by some to have won the actual battle, he himself was slain. With his death, the Connell challenge for the Kingship of Tara collapsed, this time for good. Congalach had only just managed to weather this onslaught, but the only man in his way now lay dead. He soon attacked Munster to the south, defeating the Dál Cóis from the north of that kingdom. Meath to the east was subjugated, and a fleet of ships drawn from the kingdoms of the northern half of Ireland placed upon Lough Derg, establishing Uí Néill's suzerainty over Munster. But even with such victories, a king of Tara could seldom rule unchallenged for long. Whatever was happening in Dublin during these years and its relationship to Congalach is unclear. 951 saw them launch a huge raid on his lands, taking 3,000 captives. Connacht was likewise becoming restless, and his campaign to bring it to heel was unsuccessful. Instead, it was a king from the resurgent Connell Owen of the Northern Uí Néill that subdued it, after having first made alliance with the Norse of Dublin and pillaging Brega itself. Congalach may have wanted to secure his southern flank before tackling this new threat, and so he advanced into Leinster, where he presided over an important fair of the province to demonstrate his authority. It was one that was far from absolute. On his departure, messengers hastened forth from the Leinstermen to Dublin, and an ambush was laid where Congalach, the last great lord from the Áed Sláine, was finally killed. Swift's statement of Congalach's career sums up well the situation of the kings of Brega throughout the Viking Age. The key element in making Congalach king of Ireland, and the one that finally dispossessed him, was the presence of Scandinavian Dublin on his southeastern border. Congalach marked the last king of Tara the Áed Sláine produced, and while his son remained an important figure in his subsequent career, the dynasty as a whole largely fade from history. Sources from the period hint at long periods of interregnum in the Kingship of Brega, from the death of Congalach's son in 976. Vassals of Brega had switched allegiance to Meath by the 980s, and in 996 the men of North Brega are followers rather than leaders in a raid of that year, being listed behind, and thus lower in precedence, than their former vassals, the Mugderna. Finally, the last verifiable descendant of Congalach died in the fashion of his ancestors, when in 1017 he was killed by his own people. By the 11th century, the term Brega was no longer political, but geographical. It had been absorbed completely by Meath. Even the very title of King of Brega was no longer exclusively theirs. In 1061, a king of the formerly tributary Sláine died, having usurped the title at some point prior. 85 years later, in 1146, this battle, for whatever little remained, was still ongoing, when the leader of the Uí Cunning, an O'Kelly, fell to a force of the Sláine and Vikings of Dublin. The last record I could find to a descendant of Áed Sláine as lord of what must have been a much reduced Brega is Congalach Uí Néill, who died all the way in 1292. Following Áed Sláine's death in 604 through to the death of this last lord of Brega in 1292, 688 years had passed, along with the lives of 48 kings and lords of the Síl Néa Sláine, and subsequently the cadet Uí Cunning. 33 of the 48, or 69% of these, met violent ends, most against other Uí Néill kinsmen, distant or close. This does not even include the fates of those not reckoned kings or lords by the annals or genealogies, or indeed the other branches, the Fir Cúil or Uí Chearnaigh. No wonder then that the dynasty's very name became a byword for kinslaying. How does this fare against others, however? Hogan noted of another Uí Néill dynasty, the Connell Owen of the north, that from 879 to 1607, 46% died violently, 50% of these at the hands of kinsmen. These numbers were based on all the 481 members mentioned in the annals, not just the kings and lords. In contrast, the Roman Empire and its continuation just in the west, a far, far bigger political unit than Brega, from the reign of Augustus to the death of Julius Nepos some 497 years later, saw the reigns of 77 emperors. 47, or 61% of these died violently, a startlingly close statistic. For what difference does it make the size of the kingdom when men are willing to kill and die to rule it, regardless? The system of kingship, maintained and fought over in Gaelic Ireland, was one where only the strongest could emerge to lead, and even then, he seldom remained the strongest for long. Paraphrasing Hogan, the chief sufferers of the Gaelic system were the nobility themselves. They lived dangerously, and in an extraordinarily large number of cases, died violent deaths. The seed of Áed Sláine perhaps epitomizes this better than anyone else.